In a move that sent ripples through the global automotive industry, the European Union recently unveiled a series of temporary tariffs targeting Chinese electric vehicles. For those closely watching international trade dynamics, this decision was hardly unexpected. The EU's action came as a calculated response, almost an echo of earlier sanctions that the United States had already imposed on Chinese EVs. What caught observers off guard, however, was the speed and decisiveness of China's counterpunch. Just 7 days after the EU's announcement, Beijing began orchestrating its response. And in October 2024, that response took concrete form when a major Chinese automaker made a stunning declaration. It would be scrapping its ambitious plan to manufacture 150,000 electric vehicles annually on Spanish soil. The announcement landed like a thunderclap in Madrid, forcing Spanish officials to confront an uncomfortable reality about the economic consequences of the EU's protectionist stance. Almost overnight, Spain's tone shifted dramatically. Government representatives began voicing strong support for Chinese automotive investment, while simultaneously urging Brussels to reconsider its decision to levy taxes on Chinese electric vehicles. The about-face was as swift as it was revealing, a clear indication that Spain had suddenly grasped what was at stake. But here's where the story takes a fascinating geopolitical turn. While Western nations have spent much of this year erecting barriers against Chinese electric vehicles, Russia has been rolling out the welcome mat. Moscow has extended a standing invitation to Chinese EV manufacturers, actively encouraging them to establish production facilities on Russian territory. The contrast couldn't be starker. So what does China's cancellation of those 150,000 vehicle orders really mean for Spain's economy? And is China genuinely prepared to walk away from the lucrative European market in favor of pivoting eastward toward Russia? These are the questions at the heart of today's investigation. Before we dive deeper, if you appreciate this kind of in-depth analysis of global economic shifts, please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest content. Now let's unpack what's really happening behind the headlines. The tariff wall. Europe's response to a competitive threat. The European Union's decision to impose substantial tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles was officially framed around concerns over subsidies. Specifically, allegations that Beijing was providing unfair financial support to its domestic manufacturers. But to understand what's truly driving this trade confrontation, we need to look beyond the official rhetoric and examine the deeper anxieties reshaping the automotive landscape. For decades, European and American car manufacturers represented the undisputed pinnacle of automotive excellence. German engineering marvels like BMW and Volkswagen were synonymous with quality and innovation. America's Tesla revolutionized the electric vehicle concept and dominated the premium EV market. These companies weren't just industry leaders, they were cultural icons, symbols of Western technological supremacy. But the tectonic plates have been shifting. As the global automotive industry underwent its most profound transformation since the invention of the assembly line, the wholesale pivot toward electrification, these traditional powerhouses have found themselves struggling to maintain their footing. Meanwhile, Chinese electric vehicle brands have seized the moment, capitalizing on what may be the greatest opportunity in automotive history. Chinese manufacturers have deployed a potent combination of advantages: cutting-edge battery technology developed through massive research investments, sophisticated intelligent driving systems that rival anything produced in the West, and, perhaps most importantly, production costs that undercut competitors by staggering margins. The result has been nothing short of a market revolution. Consider the numbers. Throughout 2023, Chinese electric vehicle sales in Europe surged by an impressive 40% compared to the previous year. At their peak, Chinese brands commanded more than 15% of the European EV market, a remarkable achievement for what were, just a few years earlier, relatively unknown names outside Asia. Meanwhile, Europe's established automakers have been caught flat-footed struggling to execute their own electrification strategies with anywhere near the speed or efficiency of their Chinese competitors. The financial disparities are even more striking. According to official European data compiled in 2023, the average retail price for a Chinese electric vehicle sat at approximately $32,000. But here's the kicker. The actual production cost for these vehicles was roughly half of what European and American manufacturers spent to build comparable models. On the other side of the equation, European-made battery electric vehicles carried an average sticker price of $68,000. Think about that for a moment. Chinese EVs were being sold for less than half the price of European equivalents, and Chinese manufacturers were still turning healthy profits because their production costs were so dramatically lower. This wasn't just a competitive advantage, it was a fundamental market disruption. European automakers weren't blind to the threat. Many announced plans to develop more affordable electric models with target prices around $22,000. But there was a catch. These vehicles wouldn't reach showrooms until 2025 at the earliest. In the fast-moving EV market, that 2-year gap might as well be an eternity. Every month of delay meant more market share slipping into Chinese hands. Data from the Dataforce Research Institute painted an even clearer picture of Chinese momentum. By June 2024, Chinese electric vehicles had captured 11.1% of the total European market, an all-time high. But the month-over-month growth figures were perhaps even more telling. In June alone, Chinese brands registered more than 23,000 pure electric vehicles across Europe, representing a stunning 72% increase from the previous month. To put that in perspective, the growth rate for Chinese EVs was nearly double the growth rate of the overall European electric vehicle market during the same period. Chinese manufacturers weren't just participating in Europe's EV expansion, they were driving it. The trade storm breaks. Just as Chinese automakers were accelerating their European ambitions and preparing for even greater expansion, political headwinds turned into a full-blown storm. In June 2023, the European Commission released a statement that would reshape the competitive landscape. Beginning in early July, the EU would implement temporary tariffs on electric vehicles imported from China. More significantly, Brussels announced it would unveil a final comprehensive tariff policy in October 2024, with measures potentially remaining in force for up to 5 years. The announcement detonated like a financial bomb, sending shockwaves through boardrooms in both Beijing and European capitals. The EU's official justification centered on subsidy concerns. The claim that Chinese electric vehicle companies had benefited from government financial support and were selling products in European markets below actual cost, a practice known as dumping. According to Brussels, this unfair competition was inflicting serious damage on Europe's domestic automotive industry. But this anti-dumping action created immediate turbulence. Chinese automakers who had been confidently planning their European strategies suddenly faced a dramatically altered calculus. Markets that had seemed certain became uncertain. Investment decisions that had appeared straightforward now required complete reassessment. The impact became visible quickly. Some Chinese manufacturers, confronted with the new tariff reality, abruptly hit pause on production projects. Others went further, announcing plans to cancel or indefinitely postpone the delivery of 150,000 vehicle orders destined for European markets. What was driving these dramatic decisions? Let's examine one case that illustrates the broader dynamics at play. Among the Chinese automakers caught in the crossfire of EU tariffs, few cases are as illuminating as that of Chery Automobile. As one of China's most prominent independent automotive brands, Chery had been cultivating its European presence for nearly 2 decades, having first entered European markets back in 2007. Through patient, persistent effort, the company had gradually built brand recognition and established a meaningful market foothold across the continent. In April 2023, just months before the tariff announcement, Chery had reached a milestone agreement with Spain's Ebro company. The partnership called for establishing a joint venture on Spanish soil to collaboratively develop and manufacture electric vehicles. The scale of the project was substantial. Chery planned to produce its flagship Omoda 5 model at the Spanish facility, targeting annual production of 150,000 vehicles. Beyond the cars themselves, the project promised to create more than 1,200 jobs in the local Spanish economy. When the EU's tariff policy was announced, many industry observers initially assumed that Chinese manufacturers who had already committed to building European factories, companies like Chery, would be somewhat insulated from the impact. After all, the logic went, once a factory is operational within EU borders, imported tariffs become irrelevant. The vehicles would be made in Europe, regardless of the manufacturer's country of origin. But Chery's response revealed that the situation was far more complex than simple tariff arithmetic. Rather than proceeding as planned or abandoning the project entirely, Chery demonstrated what one might call strategic flexibility, the kind of calculated patience that Chinese companies have increasingly employed in international disputes. After conducting a thorough evaluation of the new environment, Chery announced it would postpone, not cancel, its Spanish production plan. The start of production, originally scheduled for October 2025, would be delayed by a full year. On the surface, this appeared to be a pragmatic adjustment to changed circumstances. But the message embedded in Chery's decision was unmistakable. If the European Union refused to lift its sanctions on Chinese electric vehicles, Chery's production timeline might slip indefinitely. The word postponed was doing heavy diplomatic lifting. In reality, Chery was firing a warning shot, using action rather than rhetoric to communicate its position. The company was essentially saying, "We can wait. The question is, can you?" To grasp why this mattered so much to Spain, we need to appreciate what Chery's investment represented beyond simple manufacturing capacity. A facility capable of producing 150,000 vehicles annually isn't just a factory. It's an economic ecosystem. It generates substantial direct employment, as those 1,200 promised jobs indicated. But the ripple effects extend far beyond the factory gates. Such a plant creates demand for parts suppliers, logistics services, and support industries. It generates tax revenue for local and national governments. It brings technical knowledge transfer and expertise development. For Spanish workers and engineers, it offers opportunities to gain experience with cutting-edge electric vehicle technology. For the broader Spanish economy, it represents integration into global automotive supply chains. Spain's government had clearly understood these benefits, which is why Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez had repeatedly and publicly expressed support for Chinese investment in his country's automotive sector. Sanchez hadn't merely welcomed Chery's plans. He had actively called on the European Union to reconsider its decision to impose tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. His position created an awkward tension, with Spain essentially breaking ranks with Brussels on a major trade policy issue. Spain wasn't alone in its hunger for Chinese automotive investment. Other European nations were equally eager to attract Chinese manufacturers to establish production facilities on their soil. This created a paradoxical situation where European countries simultaneously supported tariffs designed to protect their automotive industries, while also competing with each other to lure the very companies those tariffs were targeting. Some business analysts have suggested that the warnings issued by Chinese automakers, the postponements and cancellations, carried a strategic message beyond the immediate projects. These actions were signaling to Brussels that the EU's approach was fundamentally flawed. Simply wielding tariffs as a stick to force Chinese manufacturers to build European factories wouldn't work if those same tariffs poisoned the overall investment climate and made Chinese companies question whether Europe wanted them at all. Countries like France and Italy had been particularly aggressive in pushing for tariffs, apparently believing that trade barriers would leave Chinese manufacturers with no choice but to establish local production if they wanted to access European consumers. In this view, tariffs would deliver a double benefit. They would protect European manufacturers from low-cost imports, while also bringing Chinese investment, jobs, and tax revenue to Europe. Some German automotive executives had even suggested that if Chinese companies faced export difficulties, they should simply build factories in Germany to maintain their European market access. From a certain perspective, this seems logical. Everyone gets what they want. Chinese companies gain tariff-free access to European markets, while European countries gain the economic benefits of hosting manufacturing facilities. But China's response suggested this logic was missing something crucial. Beijing appeared to be rejecting the premise that it needed Europe more than Europe needed Chinese investment and technology. And China had options that Europe hadn't fully considered. While China was navigating increasingly hostile waters in Europe, a dramatically different reception awaited Chinese automakers to the east. Russia was actively planning to introduce a vehicle disposal tax on imported cars, a move explicitly designed to encourage foreign manufacturers to establish local production rather than simply exporting finished vehicles. More directly, Russian officials were publicly courting Chinese automotive companies, expressing hope that more Chinese manufacturers would choose to localize their production operations on Russian soil. The deepening automotive relationship between China and Russia didn't emerge overnight. Chinese vehicles had actually been present in the Russian market for roughly 2 decades. But through 2021, their market share remained modest, just 9.1% of total Russian car sales. Chinese brands were visible but far from dominant in a market that remained heavily oriented toward European, American, and Japanese manufacturers. Then came February 2022 and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The war triggered sweeping economic sanctions from Western nations, and the automotive sector felt immediate impacts. European, American, and Japanese car manufacturers either voluntarily withdrew from the Russian market or were forced out by sanctions and supply chain disruptions. The exodus devastated Russia's automotive ecosystem. Both vehicle production and sales collapsed by more than 60%. The new energy vehicle segment, already small in Russia, was particularly hard hit. In 2022, total annual sales of electric vehicles in Russia amounted to just 840 units, a figure so negligible it was barely worth measuring. Russia's EV market had essentially ceased to exist. This created a massive opportunity for Chinese manufacturers, who faced none of the political constraints preventing Western companies from doing business with Russia. Chinese vehicles flooded into the void. In 2022, Chinese brands' market share in Russia jumped to 19.5%, more than double their 2021 position. But that was just the beginning. By 2023, Chinese automobiles commanded nearly 60% of the Russian market. Let that sink in. In the space of just 2 years, Chinese brands went from single-digit market share to absolute dominance. Russia had transformed from a minor market for Chinese exports into China's largest overseas automotive market. The numbers from 2024 told an even more dramatic story. According to China customs data, in August alone, exports to Russia accounted for more than 19% of China's total automotive exports. Chinese manufacturers shipped more than 600,000 vehicles to Russia that year, generating export revenues of $1.6 billion. Russian registration data provided ground-level confirmation of Chinese dominance. In June 2024, Russians registered approximately 124,000 new passenger vehicles. Of those, roughly 76,000, more than 60%, were Chinese brands. Walk down any street in Moscow or St. Petersburg, and you'd see more Chinese cars than anything else. For Russia, this automotive relationship with China serves multiple strategic purposes. Most immediately and practically, Chinese imports have filled the enormous gap left by departing Western manufacturers, preventing a complete collapse of Russia's automotive market. Russian consumers can still buy affordable, modern vehicles, even if they're no longer Volkswagens or Toyotas. But Russian officials are thinking beyond simply importing Chinese vehicles indefinitely. They want Chinese automakers to establish manufacturing operations inside Russia, to bring not just finished products but also technology, expertise, and production capacity. Moscow is actively encouraging this shift through policy measures like the vehicle disposal tax, designed to make local production more economically attractive than imports. From Russia's perspective, this approach would transform Chinese automakers from suppliers into partners in rebuilding and modernizing Russia's automotive industry. Local production would create jobs for Russian workers, generate tax revenue for the government, and potentially facilitate technology transfer that could elevate Russia's domestic manufacturing capabilities. For Chinese manufacturers, Russia presents an attractive proposition that looks increasingly appealing compared to the hostile environment in Europe. The Russian market is large, growing, and welcomes Chinese investment. Russian officials are actively courting Chinese companies rather than investigating them for unfair trade practices. And importantly, Russia offers Chinese automakers the opportunity to establish production capacity in a region with potential access to neighboring markets in Central Asia and beyond. The contrast between Europe's and Russia's approaches to Chinese electric vehicles illustrates a broader strategic divergence that carries implications far beyond the automotive sector. Europe, facing competitive pressure from Chinese manufacturers, has chosen the path of protectionism, erecting tariff walls ostensibly to protect domestic industry, while hoping that trade barriers will force Chinese companies to invest locally on European terms. Russia, operating under entirely different constraints and incentives, has embraced Chinese automotive integration, viewing it as an opportunity to stabilize and modernize its own struggling industry while deepening strategic economic ties with Beijing. The irony is palpable. European nations, despite their technological sophistication and wealthy consumer markets, may be inadvertently pushing Chinese investment toward Russia by making Europe feel unwelcoming and unpredictable. Meanwhile, Russia, isolated from Western economies and facing significant industrial challenges, has positioned itself as an attractive destination for the very Chinese manufacturers that Europe is trying to keep at arm's length. The tariffs that Brussels hoped would protect European automakers may ultimately prove counterproductive if they accelerate Chinese expansion into alternative markets where European companies have no presence or influence. By the time European manufacturers complete their own electric vehicle transitions and develop competitive offerings, Chinese brands may have such commanding positions in markets like Russia that reversing the dynamic becomes nearly impossible. This automotive trade confrontation exists within a larger context of shifting global economic alignments. The traditional post-Cold War order, in which Western markets and institutions held undisputed centrality in the global economy, is giving way to a more multipolar reality. China's ability to pivot from European markets toward alternatives like Russia demonstrates the limits of Western economic leverage. For decades, access to European and American markets represented the ultimate prize for manufacturers worldwide. Companies would make significant concessions and adjustments to gain entry to these wealthy, sophisticated consumer bases. But as China's economy has grown, and as Chinese companies have become globally competitive in technology and manufacturing, that dynamic has shifted. China still values Western markets, but no longer depends on them for survival. The EU's tariff strategy assumes that Chinese automakers need Europe more than Europe needs Chinese automotive technology and investment. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if the future of the automotive industry, with its rapid shift toward electrification, autonomous driving, and integrated digital experiences, is being shaped as much in Shenzhen and Shanghai as in Stuttgart or Detroit? Spain's worried reaction to Chery's postponement suggests that some European governments are beginning to grasp this uncomfortable possibility. The jobs, investment, and technological dynamism that Chinese automotive companies could bring to Europe won't wait indefinitely while Brussels deliberates. Other markets, other countries, and other regions are ready to welcome what Europe is rejecting. The unfolding drama over electric vehicle tariffs reveals fundamental tensions in how different nations and regions are responding to the most significant automotive transformation in a century. Europe is attempting to protect established industries and manage disruption through regulatory intervention. Russia is opportunistically embracing the disruption to fill immediate needs and pursue longer-term strategic goals. China is demonstrating flexibility and options that many Western observers didn't fully appreciate Chinese companies possessed. What began as a seemingly straightforward trade dispute, the EU imposing tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, has evolved into something more complex and consequential. It's revealed diverging visions of economic strategy, exposed assumptions about which markets hold leverage, and demonstrated how quickly geopolitical alignments can reshape industrial landscapes. Spain's sudden realization that losing Chinese automotive investment carries real economic costs offers a preview of the choices that European nations may increasingly face. Do they stand with Brussels and accept the loss of Chinese investment and technological partnership? Or do they break ranks and compete with each other for the jobs and growth that Chinese companies can provide? The decision facing European policymakers is genuinely difficult. Genuine concerns about industrial policy, fair competition, and economic security deserve serious consideration.